Have you ever noticed how people spend their entire lives building a safety net made of people? Children who need to call, a partner who needs to be by your side, friends who need to remember your birthday. And then a certain age comes and all that engineering starts to creak. The phone rings less, the chairs around the table empty, and most people interpret this as abandonment. Carl Jung saw something far more uncomfortable. You are not being abandoned. You are discovering too late that you built your old age on people who were always passing through. No one was made to carry the weight of your soul, and what you call loneliness is, in truth, the bill for a lifetime of outsourcing your own center. This video is not about finding new people to fill the void. It is about understanding why, according to Jung, a peaceful old age does not depend on a partner or children or friends. It depends on exactly 4 internal things. And if you have made it this far, it is because something inside you already suspects this. The first illusion to be dissected is the oldest one of all, the idea that aging well means having people nearby. From childhood you were taught that old age is measured in family photos, in grandchildren running through the living room, in Sunday dinners with a full table. And based on that promise you made silent existential calculations. I married, so I wouldn't grow old alone. I had children to have company later. I kept friendships that no longer nourish me, because one day I will need them. Notice the cruelty of that logic. You turned people into emotional insurance policies, and then you are surprised when they don't pay out. The cold truth, which Jung never hid, is that anyone can leave. A partner dies, falls ill, drifts away, or simply changes. Children grow up, create their own lives, and have no cosmic obligation to fill the existential hole you never learned to fill in yourself. Friends move away, take other paths, or lose interest when you no longer serve the role you played in their lives. Not because they are traitors, but because they are human, finite, with their own internal hungers. A secure old age is not the one with the most people around. It is the one with the deepest roots inside. And as long as you believe that another person is your root, you live in the psychological condition of a hostage. One loss is all it takes for your entire ground to collapse. Jung would call that a life lived on the periphery of yourself, an existence orbiting everything except your own center. And the price of that outsourcing does not arrive when you are 30 or 40. It arrives when the body slows down, when the world stops asking things of you, when the silence once drowned out by the rush finally gains volume. That is when the bill knocks at the door, and most people discover too late that they never even learned to be alone with themselves for 10 minutes without reaching for a phone, a television, some distraction. This brings us to the first of the 4 riches Jung pointed out as non-negotiable for a peaceful old age, the ability to be alone with yourself. And here we need to make a surgical distinction. It is not loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of those who have been abandoned from within. Solitude is the privilege of those who have finally found themselves. One is absence, the other is presence. And almost no one knows which of the two they are living, because they have never stopped long enough to ask. Observe your own behavior. What do you do in the first 3 seconds when you are left without stimulus? You pick up your phone. You turn on the TV without paying attention. You open the fridge without being hungry. You make a call to someone who doesn't even know what to say. That is not a habit. That is an escape. It is the clinical evidence that your own company has become unbearable. And the reason is simple. When you fall silent, everything you spent your life burying begins to surface. The questions you avoided, the decisions you postponed, the pains you wrapped in pretty packages and stored at the back of the closet. Jung would observe this phenomenon with a nearly icy calm. He would say that the things you buried in order to be accepted do not die. They merely change address. They move into your unconscious, and from there they leak out as insomnia, as irritation without cause, as that vague discomfort that forces you to always be doing something. You are not anxious because life is hectic. You are hectic because, if you stop, you will encounter someone you abandoned decades ago, yourself. The person who learns to be in silence is not learning to endure boredom. They are learning to endure the truth, and this is one of the rarest skills in the modern world. Whoever achieves this discovers a security that no company can offer. They discover that silence, once threatening, begins to feel like an old friend. They discover that the mind itself, once a hostile territory, can become a home. And whoever has this home does not fear being alone, because they are never alone. But I need to be honest with you now. None of this happens by chance. No one awakens overnight with this ability to inhabit themselves. It requires a method, a daily practice, a direction. And that is why I prepared O Código do Despertar for you. If you recognized, even for a second, this flight from your own silence, this discomfort when alone with yourself, this exhaustion from performing a version of yourself for others, then this discomfort is not a flaw. It is a call. It is your unconscious knocking at the door asking to be let in. O Código do Despertar is a 60-day path based on Jungian psychology, with a daily lesson that brings keys, questions, and declarations to guide you from restlessness to direction. You read it, carry out the day's micro-action, register it in your journal, and day by day the inner map takes shape. It is the practical path of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are before life charges the bill in the final silence of old age. The link is in the first pinned comment of this video. If you feel this is the moment, leave a comment with the word présent. It is your first symbolic gesture of commitment to yourself. And here we come to the second treasure, which is even more delicate, because almost no one is willing to do the work it demands. Reconciliation with one's own past. There is a comfortable myth that time heals, that all you have to do is wait, and the wounds close on their own. Jung would laugh at that idea with his cold irony. Time by itself heals absolutely nothing. Time merely pushes the wound into deeper layers, where it stops hurting in the conscious mind and begins to govern the unconscious. You no longer remember what happened at 20, but you still choose partners who repeat the same pattern. You no longer think about what your father did, but you freeze every time someone in a position of authority speaks loudly near you. You have apparently forgiven, but your body stiffens when you hear that person's name. This is not weakness. It is evidence that the wound was never treated. It was only numbed. And old age has a cruel characteristic. The anesthesia begins to lose its effect. When the pace of life slows down, when distractions diminish, when the body stops screaming louder than the soul, all those buried pains return to the surface with interest. That is why so many elderly people become bitter, not because aging is bitter, but because without internal work what emerges is the deposit of decades of unresolved matters. Guilt over old decisions, resentment toward people who are dead, regret for paths not taken, anger at oneself for not having had courage. Reconciliation in the Jungian sense is not pretending nothing happened. It is not the performative forgiveness that cheap spirituality sells. It is something much harder. It is looking at one's own history, face to face, without embellishment, without blaming only others, without positioning oneself as a perpetual victim. It is owning your part. It is recognizing that in many moments you were the author of your own pain, and that in others you were a victim of things you did not choose, but that now only you can transform. To reconcile is to turn each episode into learning, not into an excuse, not into an open scar, into raw material for wisdom. The person who does this arrives at old age with a clear conscience, not because life was perfect, but because they finally stopped fighting with what was. And whoever stops fighting with the past liberates an amount of psychic energy that most people do not even know exists. That energy is the fuel for peace in old age. It is not luck. It is work. And if you noticed while I was speaking that your past still pulses as if it were yesterday, know that this is the exact sign that there is still blockage. The Code of Awakening has specific lessons for this reconciliation, day after day, without violence, without aggressive therapy. First pinned comment. Do not let the unconscious choose the moment when this pain will return. You choose. The third wealth is perhaps the most painful to face, because it strikes directly at the identity you've spent decades building, freeing yourself from the need to be indispensable. Notice how almost your entire sense of worth has been outsourced. You feel useful when your children call asking for advice. You feel important when someone at work depends on you. You feel loved when you are sought after. And in reverse, you feel invisible, discarded, emptied when no one needs you anymore. Jung would look at this arrangement and say, with the calm of one describing gravity, you haven't built an identity. You've built a function, and functions are replaceable. People with real identity are not. That is the difference between existing and serving. And old age is the stage that, without mercy, strips your functions away one by one. You retire, and the professional function dissolves. The children grow up, and the provider function becomes decorative. Your partner passes, and the companion function loses its object. And if beneath these functions a real person doesn't exist, what remains is a shell. That's why so many people fall into deep depression upon retiring. It's not the end of work that destroys them. It's the end of the function. It's the terrifying discovery that, without being useful, they don't know who they are. The exhaustion you feel from doing endless favors isn't physical fatigue. It's the exhaustion of maintaining a borrowed identity. It's the weariness of performing usefulness so as not to disappear in the eyes of others. And every time you say yes when you wanted to say no, you are paying a small installment on this unconscious contract. I exist because I am useful. The day I stop being useful, I will cease to exist. This contract needs to be torn up before old age, because if you reach old age still signing this contract, the world will declare your emotional bankruptcy, not because people are cruel, but because life naturally reduces the demands on a slower body, on an emptier schedule, on a less central presence. And if your worth was tied to the flow of demands and the flow dries up, your worth dries up with it. Freeing yourself from this need isn't about becoming selfish. It's about discovering a purpose that continues to exist, even when no one depends on you anymore. A purpose that needs no audience, that sustains itself in silence, that sustains itself in you, cultivating what still wants to bloom, creating what still wants to be born, learning what still wants to be learned. This isn't a hobby, it's psychic survival. It's the difference between aging with a spark in your eyes and aging with that dim, extinguished gaze you see in so many people who spent their lives being indispensable to others and were never important to themselves. And so we arrive at the fourth wealth, perhaps the most misunderstood of all, learning to love without turning the other into a source of security. Because there is a kind of love that, disguised as devotion, is merely dependency dressed in fine clothes. It is the love that demands, that controls, that needs to know where the person is, who they're talking to, what they feel, whether they still care. It is the love that treats the other as an emotional crutch, a mood stabilizer, a remedy for an anxiety the person never had the courage to face alone. Jung would say with that uncomfortable precision that most relationships are not built on love. They are built on unconscious psychological contracts. You give me security, and I give you approval. You make me feel less alone, and I pretend not to see your flaws. You distract me from my empty life, and I give you the illusion of purpose. And as long as that contract holds, we call it love. But the moment one of the parties starts to change, to grow, to want air, the contract collapses. And then we accuse the other person of having changed, of having betrayed, of having stopped loving, when in truth they merely stopped playing the role of emotional supplier, a role that was never theirs to begin with. True love, in the Jungian sense, is radically different. It begins with a non-negotiable precondition. Your emotional stability is already standing before the other appears. You already stand on your own. You already love yourself. You already welcome yourself. And from that solid foundation, the other is added, never subtracted. You do not love because you need. You love because you have. And there is an abyssal difference between loving out of overflow and loving out of lack. Whoever loves out of lack consumes. Whoever loves out of overflow offers. In old age, this kind of love is virtually impossible to improvise. Either you arrive there with that maturity, or you will reproduce the same patterns of demand, control, and criticism that made your relationships exhausting your entire life. And then you blame age, blame the times, blame the new generation, when the problem was never external. The problem is that you never learned to be a complete home on the inside, and no one can inhabit you if you yourself do not yet dwell there. To love with freedom is to allow the other to exist without bearing the weight of your stability. It is to respect their individual path. It is to accept that they may leave, and that if they leave you remain whole, hurt but whole, wounded but standing, and that is the only kind of love that withstands old age, because it is the only one that does not depend on the other's constant physical presence to sustain itself. And if right now you are beginning to realize that perhaps you have spent your whole life loving out of lack, that perhaps you have outsourced your emotional security to people who could never sustain it, that perhaps you are still fulfilling psychological contracts that expired decades ago, then this is the exact moment to act. Not tomorrow, not later, now. The code of awakening was built for this crossing. 60 days in which you stop revolving around emptiness and start building a center. Every lesson, every micro-action, every journal entry is a brick of that internal house you should have started constructing long ago. Old age does not forgive those who arrive disassembled, and postponing this is choosing to arrive that way. The link is in the first pinned comment. The decision to open that link is the first act of someone who has finally chosen to stop outsourcing their own awakening. Choosing not to open is also a decision. Only the bill for that second decision arrives when there is no longer any room to renegotiate. And so we arrive at the question that runs through the entire second half of life. The question Jung used to ask his older patients, with that low voice that never needed to rise to be heard. Who are you when you lose everything you once used to define your worth? Who are you without your work badge, without the title of active father or mother, without the role of beloved partner, without the function of indispensable friend, without social recognition, without the applause, without the likes, without the audience, when all of that is stripped away, and life makes a point of stripping it away, what remains? If the answer is nothing, then there was never anyone there. There was only a sequence of masks shifting positions to please different contexts. One persona at work, another persona at home, another persona on social media, another persona at Sunday dinners, and at the core of that constellation of masks, the silent emptiness of someone who never had the time, courage, or method to discover themselves. Maturity, in its deepest sense, is not about accumulating experiences. It is about subtracting illusions. It is discovering the part of you that never depended on recognition, control, approval, or external presence. That part exists. It always existed. It was merely buried beneath decades of performance, and the encounter with that part is what Jung called individuation. It is not about becoming better. It is finally being yourself. It is not about accumulating virtues. It is recognizing yourself whole, with light and shadow, without needing to edit anything further to be accepted. And it is this person, this indestructible core, who ages in peace. Because when that core stands firm, a partner becomes companionship, not a crutch. Children become presence, not obligation. Friends become luxury, not necessity. And loneliness becomes solitude. And old age finally becomes what it always should have been, the freest phase of life. Not the most frightening, the freest, because it is the only phase where you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. You no longer need to perform. You no longer need to win. You only need to be. And being is the rarest thing in the world because almost no one has learned how. You can close this video now and return to the old engineering. Go back to demanding from others what only you can give yourself. Go back to accumulating psychological contracts that will collect their bill in your old age. Or you can accept that the illusion is over, that no one will save you from the approaching silence, and that the only possible answer to Jung's question is to begin, today, the work of discovering who you are when no one else is watching. The choice is yours, and contrary to what you have learned, it cannot be outsourced.